as soon as it was composed, and others who think it was preserved orally exclusively for several generations. This is a debate that comes down in a large part to how feasible you think it is for multiple generations of people to accurately memorize these poems of this length, and also questions about sort of the prevalence of writing as it existed at that particular moment in Greek history. I'm not sure that it will ever be resolved. Another big debate is the question of whether one person is largely responsible for each of these poems, or they are composites created by a number of poets, each building on the last. This is more of a literary question, which is more of my alley. One way that people will approach this question is to ask, is the issue of unity. Does the poem feel like a coherent whole that ties together, or does it feel like a patchwork sewn together from the minds of many people? To be fair, a poem does not have to be created by one person to feel like a unified whole. Emily Wilson, in her introduction, points out that a lot of modern movies are very creatively unified, but are the work of many people coming together. So it doesn't have to be absolutely one thing, but it's one piece of information that we can use. In my opinion, the Iliad, the poem we're not reading, feels like one complete whole in a way that I have a hard time reconciling with a gradual process of creation. For the Odyssey, though, I'm less sure. I think there are places where you could see how it could be a product of multiple poets, as various people add their own parts. But that's not to suggest that there is no thematic unity to the entire poem. In fact, one of the truly special things about the Odyssey is its ability to create thematic and narrative unity out of a structure that seems chaotic and haphazard at first glance. I will leave it to you to make your own judgment, but know that whatever you think, you will have good company in your opinion. The one possibility I haven't mentioned yet is in the question of authorship is that both poems were composed by one person. This is what any ancient person would have told you was fact, but it is not an idea that many scholars today hold. It is pretty clear that these two poems, as much as their history is intertwined, were composed separately by different people. There is no one Homer, there is only a minimum two. We can refer to the poet of the Odyssey by this name because it gets kind of wordy if you try to work around it, but I recommend not getting too hung up on the historical biography of some person named Homer. The separate composition of the two poems produces a couple of subsequent controversies. For starters, which one comes first? Narratively, the Iliad is prior, but that's no guarantee because the Greeks love writing prequels for big works of literature. However, most scholars do think that the Iliad is likely the earlier work, and my historical linguistics professor in grad school felt that the linguistic evidence was conclusive on that. So I think it's most likely that the Iliad is older. If this is correct, the Odyssey is the second oldest surviving work of Greek literature. And that presents a really interesting thing that we can think about. Does the poet of the Odyssey know the Iliad? Is the Odyssey composed in any way as a response to the Iliad? This is a very difficult question to answer, but it is fun to think about. And I'm inclined to believe that the poet does. The story draws on many of the same characters, but manages to never retell the same story as the Iliad, even in flashbacks. And there is one line about midway through the poem, we'll get to it in our second reading session, and I won't spoil it now, but I think that it hints at a relationship between this poem and its predecessor. So that's something to look forward to. So just as those are just a few of the top controversies that people fight about as they relate to this poem. I'll let you make your own decisions about these questions. The most important thing to take away from this is to think of the poem first as a song, that as far removed as we are from that context, the poem retains features that remind us that it was originally a song performed for a listening audience, probably in a communal setting like the one we're in now, as a way to entertain, as a way to remember important cultural information. That cultural information is the subject of the next section of my talk, the mythological background of the story. The central backdrop of the Odyssey is the story of the Trojan War, the most important mythic event in Greek consciousness. At the same time as the Iliad and the Odyssey were being composed and retold, many other epic poems about other parts of the story were also composed but only survive today in fragments. I'm going to give you an overview of the story, but I do want to be careful because some of these episodes have different versions or may have been invented after the Odyssey. There isn't always evidence to know whether the poet of the Odyssey had a particular version of the story in his mind when he composed the poem, and if we have multiple poets who perhaps have differing versions, it can get very messy very quickly. Now, I teach a class on Helen, and so I am a little bit biased, but I think we have to start with her. This image, by the way, is from a fresco that was revealed only about a year ago in a villa in Pompeii, showing Helen and Paris meeting for the first time. And I just absolutely love this dog down here, like breaking the fourth wall, looking at us, like even he knows that this is going to end badly. Helen is the daughter of Zeus and the mortal queen of Sparta, which is a bit awkward because she's married to Tyndareus, the king of Sparta, when she has this child by Zeus. Helen is, from the very start, preternaturally beautiful, and when she is still a little girl, she experiences an attempted abduction. Because of this, when it comes time for her to get married, her mortal stepfather, Tyndareus, sets up a competition for the men who want to marry her, who are pretty much a who's who of the important Greek heroes, including Odysseus. The king makes them all swear an oath that if anyone later tries to take her from the man who wins the competition, they will all fight to get her back. The eventual winner is a man named Menelaus, who she marries. Meanwhile, in an entirely different place and time, we have the marriage of Peleus, a mortal man, and Thetis, a goddess. A wedding that is attended by all the gods, but in true mythic form, they forget to invite one, namely Eris, the goddess of strife. Has to be her, doesn't it? Living up to her name, Eris shows up at the wedding and presents a golden apple, which she declares should go to the most beautiful goddess. 3 goddesses claim to deserve it. Hera, the queen of the gods, consort of Zeus. Athena, the goddess of wisdom and warfare and about a million other things, who we will be very familiar with in this poem. And Aphrodite, the goddess of love and sex. In order to solve this dispute, the goddesses do what the Greek gods love doing most when they're fighting amongst themselves. Find a mortal human whose life they can ruin. That particular mortal human is Paris. Excuse me. A young, unmarried prince in the wealthy city of Troy, whose father, Priam, is the king. Each goddess tries to bribe Paris to choose her. Hera promises he will rule all of Europe and Asia. Athena offers him wisdom and military prowess. And Aphrodite offers him the most beautiful woman in the world. I think you can guess which one he picks. After he makes his choice, Helen goes to Troy and marries Paris, even though she was already married to Menelaus. I'm being purposely very vague here, because every version of Helen is a little different. In some, he physically abducts her, and she goes entirely against her will. In others, excuse me, in others, she falls in love with him, thanks to Aphrodite, and goes with him without any violence. In others, Aphrodite appears directly to her and tells her she has to go. She has varying degrees of agency in the many iterations of the story, and the poet of the Odyssey never says explicitly which version he is using. We will meet Helen in our first reading section, and I invite you to think about which version you think the poet is using. Well, how much agency do you think this Helen has? So Helen goes to Troy, willingly or unwillingly, and it falls to her husband Menelaus and his rich and powerful brother Agamemnon to go and bring her back. This is the catalyst of the war. Thanks to that oath her stepfather instituted, almost all of the other major Greek heroes in Greece are obligated to go and fight for her, including Odysseus and the greatest Greek warrior, the son of the goddess and mortal man Peleus and Thetis, Achilles. There are some shenanigans, but eventually they all sail to Troy, where they find a city surrounded by extremely high walls. The actual Trojan War takes at least 10 years, and it is in the midst of this war that the united Greek warriors are fighting on behalf of Menelaus, led by his brother Agamemnon, that the Iliad takes place. Some people are surprised to learn that the Iliad doesn't cover the entire war, or even the end of the war, or even Achilles' death, but rather one brief interlude beginning with a spat between Agamemnon and Achilles and ending with a face-off between Achilles and the greatest Trojan warrior, Paris's brother Hector. It is not a poem trying to tell the whole story of this war. It is trying to tell one story within this mythic setting. Odysseus is a character in the poem, not as central as Achilles or Agamemnon, but still a prominent figure. And apologies for the spoiler, but in the end, Achilles kills Hector. Achilles himself does not die in the Iliad, but he is canonically understood to be killed later in the war, sometimes by Paris himself, avenging his brother. In the Odyssey, Achilles is already dead. The war does eventually end in perhaps the most famous episode of the story, the Trojan horse. After 10 years of trying unsuccessfully to brute force their way through the walls of Troy, the Greeks turn to stratagem. They pretend to abandon the war and return home, leaving a giant statue of a horse, supposedly as an offering to Poseidon for a safe journey home. In reality, the ships are waiting just out of sight, and their best war fighters, including Odysseus, are hidden inside the horse. When the Trojans bring it into the city, they sneak out at night and open the gates to let in the rest of the Greek army, and Troy is utterly destroyed. Thus ends the Trojan War. You can see here this vase that's only about 50 years after that 700 date of the Odyssey, showing the Trojan horse. You can see the faces of the Greek warriors inside of it. In the process and the immediate aftermath of sacking the city, the Greeks commit many excessive acts of impiety and violence. There's a sense that the violence of the Greeks goes beyond what was considered acceptable in the war, and it causes the gods who are on their side, especially the powerful Athena, to turn against them, which has consequences when it's time for them all to head home. And this brings us to the Odyssey, which is the most famous of a collection of myths that deal with the end of the story arc, the homeward journeys of these Greek heroes. The Greek word for a homeward journey is a nostos. These are nostos myths. Nostos myths, it's hard to say, about what happened to the men when they sailed home. In the poem, we will hear not just about Odysseus, but other people's homecoming journeys. And it is safe to say that very few of the Greek warriors have nice, uneventful nostoi. So the Odyssey is the tail end of this giant mythic narrative, one that is massive in scale and duration. The story encompasses all Greek mythic heroes from that particular generation, coming from all over the Greek world, fighting for 10 years with many events happening before and after. And the involvement of the gods is as direct as it gets, with many, especially Athena, still mad at Paris for not choosing her, and Apollo, as the patron god of Troy, fighting directly in the melee with the human warriors. The Odyssey sometimes feels like it has nothing to do with the Trojan War, but I think that it has everything to do with the Trojan War. And we need to understand that mythic landscape as a crucial part of the story. So with that backstory, let's turn to the poem itself, finally. I don't want to stand up here and tell you what to think before you've even had a chance to read it, but instead I want to present some themes as a series of questions that you can ponder as you are reading. I think the best introduction to the poem is the one that the poet gives himself. Here are the opening lines of the poem in Wilson's translation. Tell me about a complicated man, Muse. Tell me how he wandered and was lost, when he wrecked the holy town of Troy, and where he went and who he met, the pain he suffered in the storms at sea, and how he worked to save his life and bring his men back home. He failed to keep them safe, poor fools. They ate the sun god's cattle, and the god kept them from home. Now, goddess, child of Zeus, tell the old story for our modern times. Find the beginning. So here, this is our proem to the poem. The very first word of the poem is the word andra in Greek, which is the Greek word for a male-gendered person. This is a poem that is really just about one man, Odysseus. The poet calls him polutropos, the word that Wilson has translated here as complicated. This word polutropos is always the first big test for any translator of the Odyssey. Wilson's choice is a little meta. Translating this word is complicated. It has many nuances to it, and it's hard to perfectly render it with just one English word. In brutally literal fashion, it means many turning, poly, many tropos turns. It is a literal description of his wandering journey. But it means more than that. It describes a person who isn't straightforward. This is the first thing we learn about our man Odysseus. He is crafty, he is clever, he is deceptive. In Greek literature, there is often an exploration of the contrast between physical strength and mental acuity, between making a direct front attack on the walls of Troy and sending in a horse as a decoy. Some people achieve their goals through sheer strength and effort. Some people use strategy and craftiness. Odysseus is the most famous in Greek mythology as a trickster and a liar. This is the information the poet wants us to learn about him right away, and I urge you to listen. Do not trust a word that comes out of Odysseus' mouth. Certainly, sometimes the poem seems to celebrate Odysseus' cleverness, but as the rest of the poem makes clear, this is not going to be a straightforward glorification of him. The poem will be focused also on his suffering and his failures. The biggest of those failures we learned right away. He did not bring his men back home with him. When Odysseus leaves Troy, he has some number of men who came with him from his home in Ithaca to fight alongside him. When we encounter these men, the relationship and the power dynamic between the men and their leader is something to consider. How would you feel if you were following a man renowned for his ability to lie? Would you trust him? The poet tells us right away not only that the men died on their way home, but also why they do. They ate the sun god's cattle. This is an episode we will get in much greater detail later in the poem, but it speaks to one of the biggest themes of the poem, food. People are always eating in the Odyssey. Remember, at the beginning, I mentioned the link between these large communal feasts and performance of epic poems. This is something that we see within the poem. People are often eating together, and usually someone is playing music. So there's a meta-referential aspect to this. Imagine you're at a spectacular feast, listening to someone sing a song about mythical characters at a big feast, listening to a song. The other reason, though, that food is so important in this poem is because it is highly culturally specific. Seeing what someone eats and what they don't eat tells us about who they are, if they are like us or not like us, or even human in our eyes. As you are reading, what characters eat will give you information about who and what they are, how much we are supposed to think they are, to use a rather charged term, normal. This ties in with the fourth line about his journey, where he went and who he met. Odysseus' travels are going to be a central aspect of the poem. Not all of it, but a major part. In a maritime culture like this one, even if you're not on your way home from fighting in a massive 10-long-year war, at some point you may get lost at sea and wash up on some stranger's shore. This experience of the lost stranger is another key idea of the poem. What does it feel like to be in a strange place, to wander, to be lost, and think, perhaps correctly, that you will die before you ever reach your home. But the poem is also interested in the other side of the perspective. What happens when someone washes up on your shore? This is the greatest theme in the poem, and I put the Greek term here in the corner, xenia. Xenia is sometimes translated as hospitality, but it's a much bigger concept than that. Xenia is how you treat the complete stranger who comes to your home unannounced with absolutely nothing. You take him in, you give him a bath, food, a place to stay, gifts, maybe your daughter's hand in marriage, anything that he needs. Because Zeus watches over the stranger and expects you to take care of him. Just as you can tell what you should think of characters we meet by what they eat, we can also tell what we are supposed to think of them by whether and how they practice xenia. We will see the whole spectrum of welcomes that a stranger can receive in the poem. But xenia goes beyond just welcoming a stranger into your house. It creates a bond between the host and the guest that is deeply sacred and powerful. You, as the guest, have obligations too. You should never overstay your welcome, and if your host ever comes to your house, you take them in just as lavish a fashion. And that bond lasts even beyond your own lifetime. Your descendants inherit it. There's a memorable scene in the Iliad when two warriors are facing off, one for the Greeks, one for the Trojans, and they decide, as one does, to recite their genealogies before they try to kill each other. And it turns out that one of their ancestors hosted the other one's ancestor long, long ago, and they exchanged gifts, and they created this bond. And these two men, they don't just decide not to kill each other, they stop, they strip off their armor and exchange it in the middle of the battlefield. It's amazing. This is how deeply felt this idea of this bond between guest and host is in this culture. So xenia is another thing that I want you to look out for. Now, these opening lines tell us a lot about the poem, but once you've read the whole thing, I think you will find this introduction incomplete. I know Kara said no spoilers, but I do want to warn you about two narrative choices in the poem that these opening lines may not prepare you for. The first is that after setting up this poem as singly focused on one man, the poet decides not to introduce that character for 4 books. We won't meet Odysseus until book 5 of the Odyssey. We'll talk about it, don't worry. The second narrative choice that you may want to know about is that everything that is explained in this poem happens in the first half of the poem. This introduction gives us a pretty good preview of that first half. The second half is more challenging in some ways, less magical, but more psychologically interesting. Because simply arriving in the geographical place where you were born is not the same thing as coming home. Coming home is a process that will take the entire poem, that whole second half, even though he won't have far to travel anymore. If the first half is about the experience of travel, of being a stranger in strange places, then the second half is more interested in the issue of being a stranger in a familiar place. How do you know when you're safe and who you can trust? Odysseus has been gone from his home for 20 years. That is a long time. Many things have changed. His child was a baby when he left and is a young man now. His wife has been by herself for that whole time. This is a scenario that allows for another facet of Odysseus's polutropos nature to shine through. I think by the time we get to that point in the poem, you will understand the risks that he is facing and why that metaphorical journey home is just as hard as the physical one. So those are, in a nutshell, the main themes that I encourage you to start with while reading the poem. Travel, food, xenia, home, all of these ideas are tied together, and we're going to experience them through the perspective of that one oh-so-complicated man, Odysseus. And that brings us back to Emily Wilson's translation. And I do want to take some time to talk about how it connects to the Greek language in the poem. I am not related to her, but I do feel honored about to say that she was my professor in grad school. I am actually thanked in the acknowledgments of the Odyssey. That's a little flex. And so I'm not perfectly impartial here. I do use her translations in my classes, and a major reason is simply that the students can understand them. Many other translations of the Odyssey intentionally adopt an old-fashioned style of language. Even in 700, when audiences were listening to this poem in some kind of communal setting, it was a story from long ago, and the Greek that Homer uses was supposed to sound old. And so I understand the impulse of translators to try and replicate that. Wilson rejects that impulse and argues that any English translation is equally distant from the Greek of Homer, and she wants to use simple language to reflect other aspects of the language that can get lost in that old-timey tone. She has also chosen to translate in verse. The meter of the Odyssey is known as dactylic hexameter, and it was marked as the meter of the epic genre. In a song culture, meter is one way of communicating the type of song you are listening to. Our ears may be less attuned to the significance of different meters, but Wilson has chosen to translate the poem into iambic pentameter, which has the closest symbolic value in English to dactylic hexameter in Greek. It is the meter used in narrative verse by many Anglophone poets, including Chaucer and Milton. She has made some intentional decisions about language that I think are worth noting. One reason I use her translations in my classes is because she does not use euphemisms for enslaved servants who abound in the poem. Other translations often speak of handmaids and swineherds, and do not mention that they are also slaves. You will never be in doubt as to the enslaved status of a character in her translation, and I think that is extremely valuable for understanding the power dynamics at certain points in the story, and for giving us a different perspective on the question of loyalty than the poet necessarily has. She also makes the perhaps more controversial decision to vary her translations of some formulaic Homeric language. These formulas are simply repetitions that reflect the orality of the composition, set phrases that occur over and over because they can fit conveniently into one meter. One of the most notable types of formulas in Homeric Greek are the epithets, or adjectives always attached to characters and certain other entities. You may have heard of the wine-dark sea, or swift-footed Achilles, or rosy-fingered dawn. Wilson has not picked one fixed translation for these epithets, but rather she varies her translation depending on the context, which makes it a little harder to see the repetition that is such a distinctive part of the Homeric language. Another rather famous instance of Wilson's intentionality with language is her translation of descriptive terms of women. Gender is a complicated topic in the Odyssey. On the one hand, it reflects the misogyny and patriarchal hierarchy that existed in the culture that created it. On the other, it has perhaps the largest collection of interesting, nuanced, deeply human female characters that you will find in any work of Greek literature. Wilson is the first woman to publish an English translation of the Odyssey. Earlier male translators sometimes fell back on sexist English terms for some of the descriptions of women in the poems, even though this is not an accurate rendering of what the Greek is trying to convey. Wilson is thinking about what the text says about these women and how best to convey that. Reading the translation is always a complicated process. I'm happy to discuss the Greek with you if you have questions as we go forward, but I think it's a valid choice to focus on the text as we have it here in English, to think about the nuances and literary aspects of the poem as they are on the page without needing to worry about whether they are the product of the translation or the Greek. In truth, those literary qualities will likely be a product of the work of both Wilson and the poet, or poets of the Odyssey, and this is just another opportunity to move away from thinking about the poem as the product of one solitary genius. If we focus on the text, on the language as it is available to us, I think you will find plenty to explore. Thank you.